Hi, welcome to 2020 Tasty Treats with GourmetQuilter. We're doing the foundation piece blocks for this particular treat. We've got 20 different blocks. There's a picture of the 20 blocks here. We're not making them in any particular order. We made the tree the first time. This time we're making a star block. So it's going to look a bit like this. There are 4 segments in this block. So if you've already gone to GourmetQuilter and registered to receive the pattern, you'll have a pattern like this that you can print out onto your paper ready for doing the foundation piecing. So I've gone ahead, I've cut my pattern into the segments that I need, just a little bit larger than they will end up being. I've got my pieces of fabric. I've just made sure that they're large enough for each area that they're going to cover. So I've got them all ready to go, and this is how I like to get my blocks ready. I like to have them all sort of sitting there so that I can go through and do all the different stages. So I'm ready to get started. I think we're pretty much underway. We are going to be putting in this piece number 1 here first. So I'm just going to place that behind my fabric, behind my paper pattern, as I've done, to make sure that it's fully covered when I do those seams. And then we're going to put piece number 2 on there. So we're going to put that fabric right sides together. Remember, we're working with everything back to front here. Now, because my fabric is a little bit longer, I can see where it's sitting because it's coming out either side, and so I can position that so that it's going to go behind. But we do need to make sure when we're sewing funny angles like this that things are going to sit in the right place and be large enough for the area. So one way of doing that is folding it along the line that we're going to sew, and then pressing that over and making sure, hopefully you can see enough through your piece of paper to see where your area is going to be. And so when you fold it over like that, because we're flipping this one back, that's the same as having this one over that way. Just, you might need to trust me on that point. So I'm finding that there's actually just a touch short up here, so I need to bring that piece of fabric up a little bit because it's not going to be covered at the moment. So that's going to be my stitching line right along the edge of the fabric there. I can now see that my pattern is fully covered all around by the fabric behind. So I know now that I can stitch along that line, and that is all going to work for me. So I'm going to pop a pin in there to hold them so that it doesn't slide around, and I'm going to stitch just a little bit beyond where we're going to stitch, so not right out to the edge because this line stops with the next one, but we want to stitch a little bit beyond it because that's going to be in the seam allowance there, and we can stitch right out to the edge at this end. So I'll go ahead and stitch that, but it's important that you know that when you flip it back it's going to be big enough. So that's one way you can do it, is by flipping your pattern and checking it that way. So now I can fold that back again, and now I can trim that seam there, so I can trim my 1/4 inch or ever so slightly less. Don't need that. I can press that so that I know it's all sitting nicely. And so these bits that are extending beyond at the moment are fine. They will all get trimmed off later. So we've got piece 1 and piece 2 on now. Now we need to do piece 3. Piece 3 is a little bit larger, so I've used a wider strip for my main piece, and this also is on an angle, so we're going to have to make sure that everything's going to come back, because the temptation is to sort of sit it under there and say, oh yes, that's going to fit, but it doesn't always work that way. And you think, oh, I'll just line that line up there and that'll fit, and it may or it may not. In this case, that line probably will allow it to fit. So if you've stitched like I have right into that little area there, you just want to pull that apart so that the fabric sits flat, the paper is allowed to tear. So the same thing, we're going to fold back our line so that when we place our piece of fabric behind, we can see that wherever we're going to be stitching it, it's got to be long enough to sit around on everything. So I'm just going to make sure that it's big enough to fit this piece here that we're trying to cover, that it's going to fit that and stitch along that line. And it is, I know it is. It's sitting within here, and it's sitting all within here, here and here. So I now know that that is going to be large enough to flip back. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that. This probably looks worse than it is. When you're actually just doing it, it starts making more sense. So we're going to flip that back and make sure that we're right, and we are right. Everything is covered there. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim back that seam allowance now. So make sure you're not trimming away the piece that you want to stay. And I'm going to press that, and then I'll trim this piece up so that you can see that it's all working. Because this has got some awkward shapes in it, but then that's one of the reasons we do this foundation piecing, is to cope with these awkward shapes. So it's looking pretty good so far, so I'll just trim it up. And you'll notice on the corners some of them have got just little short bits. It's worth just trimming them in the direction. It just allows for your points and things, just to trim off those funny little corners like that. So it's a little V rather than having a great long point on it. So there we are. It fits, everything's the right size, it's the right shape. So that's looking pretty good. So that was piece A. We've got 4 segments to make. The next one is segment B. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to position, it's just 3 segments and it's a triangle at the end. So I just can position that on there, just the same as we've been doing. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my segment B. I might just stitch this first one on first. And then I'll go ahead and finish segment B and show you segment C. So I've gone ahead and I've stitched my 3 pieces onto my segment B, so I'll just trim that up now as well, and then we'll get started on segment C. So by now you'll start to realise there is a little bit of a rhythm that goes with this. You kind of position, you stitch, you flip, you trim and press, and then you start all over again. I'm just going to trim off these little corners. And there's my next segment, which is looking a whole lot like this middle segment, except I'm using slightly different colours again. So that's going to end up joining in there. So I'm going to get going now on segment C. So segment C is very like A, but it doesn't have this large triangle that's in the centre at the bottom. So it's just 2 pieces, so really not that hard for you to work that one out. By now you've got the hang of all this amazingly. So C1 is the coloured piece and C2 is the background piece. So I'll go ahead and get my C done, and then we'll have a quick look at section D. So I've gone ahead, I've stitched my line, I've trimmed my seam, and now I'm just going to trim my whole segment. And the little corners. And there's the next segment done. So this star is happening. So that's really good. There's just the top little point to do of the star now. So again, it's only 3 pieces. We've got a centre piece, which is the colour, and then I've just got the 2 side pieces to put on. So we just put them on in order, put number 2 on next, and then number 3, and then I'll come back and show you all the segments done and joining them up. So I've gone ahead, I've made my 4th segment, so I've got all 4 segments of my star block done here now. Now we need to join the segments up. So this is not just a straight block where you can just join strips, so we've got to work out which ones we go where. So this is going to go to this one so that we get a straight line through there, so that we can then join that on to there, and then that will all be joined, and that will then allow us to join this last piece on top. So I'll go ahead and I'll join these. Because we've trimmed everything up, everything has its 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we can just go ahead and do that. Because we've done, one other little point, because we've done that little fancy bit of trimming on those corners, and I didn't on this little one, that makes all the difference when you're doing this sort of thing, to make sure that they're sitting as you'd like them to sit when you join the pieces together. So I've now just, it was only a tiny trim on that little point, but it was on the dotted lines there to do it. When we join this up, we now know that that is the right edge to place that next to. So I think you'll find that it becomes quite self-explanatory as you go on if you do it. It is a fairly detailed type of work to do this foundation piecing, but it does end up giving us such a wonderful result. So again, sewing on that line, just 1/4 inch in. And I'm going to, we will need to pull our papers out, of course, afterwards. But in the meantime, I'm just going to press that seam open because I want it to sit open, and I'm going to be joining a seam right across here. So I don't want this extra bulk in here, so I am going to pull out that seam allowance segment there and here, so that I don't have that extra bit, because that would be much harder to pull out afterwards. So I can get rid of just those little bits, but I can leave the rest for the moment. And so now we need to join this piece to this piece, and again our little trimmed corners will all match, so that it helps us position so that we get everything, because you want your seams to be matching where possible with this sort of work. So that all helps with that. So there is a reason for that finicky little trimming on those corners. Just make sure that everything is still sitting together nicely. We're going quite well. I'm just going to press that seam open. So I've gone ahead, I've joined up my piece, I'm pretty happy with my points matching up there, and now there's just this last top segment to go on, which is just a straight segment. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll have our block finished, because then all that's left is for you to take all your papers and things out. So I can join this up and we can have a look at it done. Now I can press that last seam. I have found with foundation piecing I do like to have them pressed open. And there we have our star block. I'm pretty pleased with that star block. So it just needs the papers pulling out, but I'm not going to do that in front of you. You can work out how to do all that at home now. Just remember, when we're stitching, we used a slightly smaller stitch than we usually use, and don't forget, if your paper's a little bit tough, use some sort of a water spray, that will help, and maybe some tweezers or a pin to help you pull some of those pieces out. And so that was block 2 of our foundation blocks, and please have a look on GourmetQuilter.com for some more information on the 2020 Tasty Treats, and we'll see you again for block 3.